Hello everyone, it's Monday the 13th of July and this is episode 80 of the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host Ben Eagle. We're heading to Somerset today for the main feature and I'll be speaking to arable and pig farmer Fred Price. Before that though, let's dive straight in with a look at some news stories from the past week. After an often unbelievably difficult growing season, winter malting barley crops have started to be harvested across the south of England and yields are proving better than expected. The winter barley cropped area is hugely down with more spring barley in the ground due to the wet autumn in 2019. However, overall, the barley yield is expected to be on par with last harvest. The campaign group Wild Justice has launched a crowdfunding appeal to begin a legal challenge to the badger cull in England. They met their fundraising target of just under £50,000 in less than 3 days, while Justice want to specifically challenge the legality of free shooting in the context of the badger cull. It's been announced that the 3 meat levy boards in the UK will launch a joint campaign to promote British lamb, with consumers to be encouraged to make it lamb. This follows similar campaigns for beef and dairy. MasterChef judge John Turode is said to be supporting the campaign, which will include a variety of recipes using lamb. And that is the news for now. It's now time for our main interview of the show, which this week features Somerset arable and pig farmer Fred Price.
It's Farmer Focus.
This morning, I'm joined by a Somerset farmer who shifted the focus of his farming thinking a number of years ago towards a system with diversity at its heart. Farming 250 acres at the foot of the Quantock Hills, Fred Price grows traditional varieties of wheat, malting barley and rye, as well as producing pigs for restaurants in London, Bristol and a local charcuterie. The farm was a purely arable enterprise until 2012 when Fred introduced the pigs and began to pursue a model of agroecological farming, more on this later, a subject that I'm sure that we will delve into today. Fred, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's really good to have you here. It's great to be speaking to you. I know that we were planning on doing this face-to-face, but a certain lockdown happened.
Yeah, no, I mean, but Zoom seems to fill a hole, definitely.
Yeah,
Pleasure
absolutely.
to be here.
Oh, it's great to have you. I gave you a brief introduction there, but I wonder if you can just start by introducing yourself, a bit on your background, and a bit about the farm.
Yeah, well, I'm Fred. I farm in Somerset, which is in the southwest of the UK, about an hour down the M5 from Bristol, just at the foot of the Quantock Hills. Pretty wet kind of environment to farm in, particularly after the winter we've just had. That's pretty fresh in the memory. But yeah, no, the farm is a small family farm that passed to me through my mum's family. My aunt ran the farm for 25, 30 years before me, and before her, my grandfather. It's 250 acres now of owned land. And also we've just added 130 acres on a 5-year business tenancy. I'd probably say we're a mixed farm now.
Yep.
Probably around half of the farm is down to grass, mixed herbal lays. And the other half is in rotational arable, and we grow everything we need for the pig diet. And the surplus goes to bakers and mills, mostly in the southwest.
Super. Tell me about your life growing up, because you grew up in London.
That's right. Yeah. So I grew up in London. Used to spend a lot of weekends and holidays down here with my grandma and my aunt, and moved in with them when I went to university. And my parents moved in to the main farmhouse around the same time. Mum grew up here, so
okay.
It's kind of come full circle. Yeah. But it's funny because despite kind of, I guess, a slightly alternative route into agriculture, for the first few years of running the farm here, which must have been 10, 12 years ago, I pretty much verbatim followed the industry narrative.
Yeah.
For a smallish farm, how do you deal with the pressures of producing a cheap commodity? and that is try and expand at every opportunity, try and vertically integrate the supply chain and produce as much as possible, really focusing on yield. So I've sort of it's been a bit of a roller coaster, a decade, I tell you. Yeah.
Did you always want to farm, or did you consider doing other things?
Yeah, definitely. I think if I'm honest though, 20 years ago, I thought farming was driving tractors, and I couldn't get enough of it. So I think what my understanding of and my passion for the farm has definitely evolved. But 100%, it's all I can remember ever wanting to do, ever doing in my spare time. And I've kind of pursued it probably pretty overly dogmatically, really. Yeah.
Tell listeners a bit about the history of the farm and what it was like when you first began to run it.
So my grandfather came here in the 50s, early 50s, and he set about turning the farm into a kind of industrial commercial pig system.
Okay.
And it's interesting, all indoors by the time he was 5 or 10 years in, although they did start by breeding outside. And kind of being reflective on it, it's kind of weird to think that even in the 50s and 60s, the same sort of pressures that our industry is under now, he focused on growth and yield and genetics and output. He vertically integrated his supply chain. He cubed his own food, and he tried to get as big as possible. But at one point the farm had 20, 25 people full time, loads of sort of satellite pig units around, and it's a model that didn't look after him in the same way it didn't look after me. By the time he actually died in his early 50s.
Okay.
So this is probably the early 80s, mid 80s.
Okay.
By the time he passed the farm to his 4 daughters, there was only 2 blokes working here, and there wasn't a pig on the farm, and hadn't been for 5 to 10 years. That kind of
massive change. Yeah,
massive shift. So my aunt really took on the mantle, Caroline, and I think the overriding strand to her 25 years here was just keep going, keep the farm in the family, and hope everything right back cost-wise. And I think not having really had a handle on it myself during that period, but at times when straw was making more money than the grain that they were selling, it must have been fairly traumatic. But thankfully, sacrificed really in a way, because she could have probably done anything. Kept the farm in the family, and meant that there was something there for me to take on, and how lucky I was. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So when you were talking about when you first started managing the place, you were focused on let's say a certain type of management. Tell me about those first few years, and what was going through your mind at that time, the kind of practices that you were doing.
Well, I guess as a small, in inverted commas, family farm, we lacked the kind of economy of scale to bring our overheads down. And so my only lever of profitability was yield. If I grow 12 ton a hectare every week instead of 7 or 8, then in theory I bring my cost of production down per ton, and the difference is profit.
Yeah.
And so I really did push hard for yield, and it was weird after a few years to that was my first kind of failure in a sense, because we were achieving really impressive yields, but financially we were in a really awful place. I did get to the point 3 or 4 years in, combination of bad harvest and wet year, I think it was 2012, 2013, where I ended up financing inputs for the next year's crop based on the harvest I hadn't even had yet.
Yeah.
And you factor in also, I'd taken out higher purchases on machinery in order to kind of deliver these inputs in an accurate way, in an efficient, timely way. And by inputs, I mean we were pushing it hard on nitrogen. We were using 4 or 5 fungicide applications to our cereals, and a whole host of trace elements, micronutrients, you name it.
Doing everything that the agronomist book tells you.
Yeah, and I think so. If you take the capital kind of heavy side of it to one side and just focus on the variable costs, I think what really unlocked the thought process in my mind was that we were seeing this plateau in yield, maybe even a negative slant, and this idea that in our industry, input costs, variable costs, and yield have some sort of linear relationship where the more you do, the better the outcome. I just discovered the hard way that wasn't the case. And I think I put that down to some of the inputs that we were using having a kind of detrimental effect on what you might say is the underlying fertility or natural fertility, i.e. soil health. And I think I'm principally talking about fungicides, insecticides, and soluble nitrogen.
Yeah.
So really, that was the first 3 or 4 years was a kind of a lesson in failure and trying to working out what the problem was rather than knowing what the solution or the journey that I was about to go on would be.
Yeah. That's really interesting that you use that word failure. Actually, I was talking with Andy Gage, an Essex farmer, on the podcast several weeks ago now, about that whole sort of when you fail, you learn and you innovate. So, what were the key things that you were trying to move towards, I suppose, at that time, and what steps did you start to take in place to begin to move towards the kind of system that you now have?
So, like in broad terms, I think I changed my focus away from a kind of crop focus to a soil focus.
Okay.
So before we were trying to manage the crop to reach its potential. And in essence, everything from this point onwards became about soil upwards, manage the soil to get a good crop. Everything else follows.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a dangerous door to open, because once you start thinking from the soil upwards, you realize there's a whole host of things you're not doing that you need to be doing. But more difficult is there's a whole load of things that you are doing that you really need to work out a way of winding your neck in on. And specifically, what I'm talking about really is 2 things. And I didn't think these at the time. This is me looking back on the journey and kind of thinking, oh yeah, okay, so you can put these things in these boxes. And one is we shifted from managing nitrogen as the main kind of crop input to managing carbon. And here what I mean is I was watching Joel Williams like on YouTube or something, and he had this picture of the soil food web. Mm-hmm. And it kind of, that for me really just made all these things that were going on in my brain just fit together in a really sort of nice visual way. I think I've worked in like pictures, and I'm quite sensory rather than technical.
Yeah.
And this idea that, you know, if you focus on the bottom of the food web, and the carbon is the feed source of microorganisms, and therefore push carbon in at one end, you get a really vibrant, dynamic soil ecosystem, and the kind of death and decay and the natural cycles that happen through that web release nutrients, soluble nutrients in an organic form available for crop and plant health. So if you just focus on carbon, everything else follows. And then the wonderful thing about the soil food web analogy is that it's not just about feeding the crop, it also creates the environment that the crop needs to grow. It induces soil like aggregation and good soil structure, a healthy population of all kinds of different things in the soil that mean that one pathogen can't kind of dominate. It increases, nutrient availability as well as the plant's ability to get nutrients. So that I like the soil food web, and that was kind of motivated a real focus on carbon as a management decision. And then the other thing really was trying to like embed diversity into our crop rotation at every kind of level. So I don't just mean crop rotation, I mean bring it right back to within one field, so intercropping, but then even within one monoculture. So within a wheat crop, within one field, we want genetic diversity. Yeah. And I feel like the reason for that is purely to build resilience.
We mentioned two sort of terms, agroecology and regenerative farming, in the introduction. What do those mean to you? Because I mean, what you've just been talking about, that's describing it in many ways. But what does it actually mean?
Yeah, so I think if regenerative agriculture isn't a thing, it's much more sort of more performed, as it were. Like it's okay. How you see the farm, it's how you feel when you're walking on a farm. it's quite sensory, and it informs all of your decision making. And there are some like overbearing values, and they're mostly agronomic and biological. It's about thinking about how nature operates and trying to tailor your practices in that image, I think. But it's not a kind of easily defined, codified set of what a farm will look like, a regenerative farm or a non-regenerative farm. And that's why, no two regenerative farms look the same, because everyone in their own environment, their own context, informed by the same kind of values, comes up with a different solution. But it's also, I think, why regenerative over particularly the last 12 months, but really the last few years, has gained such traction, because it's not easily kind of codified or written down, and therefore not commodified that easily. And so it's been able to break down a lot of the barriers and the disconnects within our industry. So big, small, organic, conventional, pastoral, arable, everyone can be regenerative. My goal has been to start by saying, how do I want to grow this pig or this cereal crop or this bean crop, and then work backwards.
Yeah.
And if you rewind 10, 12 years ago, I was starting by saying, well, what's the price of this commodity, and therefore how do I need to grow it? And that's what took me down the industrial, intensive, productivist kind of thought process.
But interestingly, on a business level, has changing the way that your model, has it impacted vastly on your bottom line, on your profitability?
Well, yes, we're profitable and we've got a long-term future. If I'd have carried on farming the way I did for the first 3 years, we wouldn't be having this conversation now.
There we are.
Even if you did want to talk about 12-ton hectare wheat crops, which you're probably not that interested in. But there's two things to say there. I mean, one, it's not so much about making more money; it's about knowing how much money you need to make and making that money every year.
Yep.
It's about resilience. I mean, there were, in the first 3 or 4 years, there were years where I did actually make more money than we make in an average year now. But there were also, like, for every year like that, there's 2 years you've got to weather losses, and another year or two that you break even. So it's this kind of boom and bust, stressful business I couldn't handle, I think. But that's one side of it. It's profitable but resilient, and it's also much lower risk, because it's not as capital intensive. But the other side of it would be the way we think about profit on the farm. So we used to have a rotation where we thought of everything through the lens of a gross margin for crop X or Y or Z.
Yep.
And now, part of our system, you have to acknowledge that there are elements of the rotation that you're earning the right to sort of draw down on with other elements of the rotation. So I'm thinking mainly the cover crops and the grass, which are two big levers of like carbon building diversity, that earn us the right to grow a half decent crop of cereals without inputs at the end of it. So how do you account for those progressive parts of your system? You can't just say, well, wheat's my most profitable crop, so I'm just going to grow wheat. So we look at the farm as a whole gross margin, a farm gross margin now, which is a really powerful way of enabling you to place value on things that you might not have done and therefore wouldn't have put into the rotation 10 years ago.
You're not registered organic, but in essence, you follow organic principles. But why have you decided to not go through the registration process?
So yeah, I mean, I've learned so much from organic farmers. Some of the most obvious things when you come to the farm here are just completely ripped off from farms I've visited, who have had their system perfectly tuned and balanced.
It's called collaboration.
Yeah. Well, that's a kind word for it. I've definitely just stolen everybody's ideas. No, I for me, and I can say this, having gone through the journey and tried to unpick what was really driving my production system 10 years ago, as I said, was the fact that we were producing a commodity with no control on price. And the other thing about commodities is they're big scale and they're competitive. If you look at what the alternative might be, it's something that's on a human scale. It's relationship based. It's around trust, and it's around collaboration. And therefore, the way that we do business is which are now friends. The bakers are my friends, I hope. And they visit the farm and they assess their own appetite for what we're doing. And in that model, you don't need a label. Whereas I can understand that whenever organic was first coined 20 or 30, 40 years ago, you tell me, you needed a label because it was operating from within a commodity system, which needed to distinguish itself from the other. Whereas we've managed to build our business around people, basically, and that's my label. That's good enough for me.
I want to talk about your heritage grains. Why do you focus on traditional cereal varieties, and how did you find a market for your grains?
So why did we? I mean, I ought to just like come clean straight away and say,
okay,
I really don't have any attachment or affinity or romantic notions around growing heritage grains on the farm. But what they offered me 5 or 6 years ago when we started going to gene banks and growing on accessions was a way out of our modern genetics, just an alternative. And I'm no plant breeder, I'm not a scientist. So, but what they all have in common is two things. One, they have a lower harvest index than modern varieties. So for me, that means lower grain yield, but it means a direct trade to putting in resources into things like rooting, like tillering, like tiller retention, like crop height. So competitive against weeds, more resistant against diseases like septoria down here, which is spread by rain splash up the plant. So taller plant, same number of leaves, bigger physical barrier between leaves. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is like looking at them as inspiration for how we might develop our own agroecological cereals. And that is that, 500 years ago, cereals were not grown as genetic monocultures in fields. They were diverse populations of genetics that were farmed in the same way. You plant them at the same time, you harvest them at the same time, you feed them in the same way, you mill them in the same way. But the way they behave in the field is they have a genetic buffer against particular diseases and idiosyncrasies of seasons. But also, because there's genetic diversity within this population, it buffers itself over time as well. So as your farm evolves and your practices evolve, your soil evolves, or your climate evolves, changes, so your cereal population can adapt over long timescales to something which is really suited to your context. I mean, I should acknowledge that there's a particular narrative that's appealing for bakers that is attached to strong stories of some of these, in inverted commas, heritage varieties.
Yeah.
I really do think that the level of engagement from bakers, certainly here on farm, and most who I've visited across the UK, is really a deep understanding of what we're saying about what the farmer needs from a cereal variety. And it's not something that tells a really nice story of a romantic red lammas wheat grown 500 years ago. It is something that's current and resilient and embodies those two things that I'm saying, the harvest index and the genetic diversity. And there's only one example of any cereal that's gone through that process and become certified, and that's the Wakelands YQ population, which is a cross-composite population. So it's building in genetic diversity. And that's the work of the late Martin Wolf. And really that's, I think, where I'd like to head. So it's a sort of collaboration between a few people in the UK, myself and Colin Gordon at the moment. And what we're doing is we're going to gene banks, getting literally thousands of accessions of cereals, planting them up, making value judgments over 3 or 4 years, and probably narrowing it down to maybe even 5 or 6 varieties that we think have really exciting characteristics, and then letting scientists and geneticists have those 5 or 6 and do wonderful things with them. So cross them together, which might produce 2,000 or 3,000 different genotypes from that one cross.
Okay.
So people like Ed Dickin I'm talking about here at Harper Adams, and then growing that to the F1 or the F2s, which is hugely diverse as our production cereal. So we're kind of looking at it by making these crosses. So that it very much in the image of Martin's work with YQ. So that's, and I do really believe, certainly in the Southwest, that the bakers are are following that narrative. That's just as strong a narrative to communicate with their customers as a kind of romantic Red Lammas type narrative, I think.
Yeah. No, that is incredibly exciting. As much as I want to carry on talking about that, let's talk about your pigs and the way you market them. Tell me about the pigs.
The reason we have pigs is basically to try and pay for some of those productive parts of our system that are earning us the right to grow good cereal crops, so herbal lays and cover crops. So the pig system is completely reverse engineered around that requirement to eat grass and to eat forage. And so I'd say we're 50 or 60% forage based pig diet through the whole year, which is really exciting and translates to a nice flavour and things. We were very lucky to work with a couple of restaurants 2 or 3 years ago in London, and they've kind of taken us on their journey and vice versa. And for me, it was a huge learning curve, because when we always kept a few pigs and tried to sell them direct. And I think from a meat perspective, like, it's quite a well-versed food chain that does that. It's not like trying to break down the barriers in a global grain economy, like people have been doing it for 20 years. So we've been doing that for 5 or 10 years, and but on a very small, like, hobby scale, really. But what farm to table meant, 5 or 10 years ago, was essentially come down to the farm, take a few nice photos, and then greenwash your menu with someone's name at the bottom. So I'm being really cruel. But I, from a farmer's perspective, that's what it was. Whereas Smoke and Goat and Kill in these restaurants in London, Ben and his whole team come down several times through the year, and they absolutely started the conversation 3 years ago by saying, what do you need to make this work? And they were saying, like, how many do you need us to buy, and what price do you need us to pay? And that's generally how we started the whole project. So the last few months has been a bit stressful, because we were pushing 60 to 70% of what we produced to London. So we've had to be slightly agile, and we're probably more resilient coming out of it than we were going in. But yeah, it all goes, if not direct, then it feels direct. And all the people that handle our pigs on the way through, the kind of middlemen that kind of have a bad name somehow. Well, for us, the middlemen all do things that we have no idea about, like butchery and aging and hanging the meat and logistics and food standards and all of that stuff. Like, that's not what gets me out of bed, and I've got no idea, and I'd be terrible. That's all of it. So it just enables me to focus on what the farming. They had such a huge amount of value for the Warren. And we started doing some meat boxes, which is more direct. But yeah, it's all reaching somebody. There's a people, there's a relationship that mediates all of our off-farm transactions.
If you could send one message to the great British public, what would it be and why?
Well, actually, I'm sorry, these are really short answers now.
Oh, that's fine.
This is so clear to me. It's learn who your farmer is and how your food is being farmed, and assess what your appetite is for it.
Nice, as simple as that. And finally, a message to your fellow farmers.
Well, it's got to be about collaboration, doesn't it? Let's bring down the perceived perceptions of barriers and things between all these different types, because there's something to learn in every farming system, isn't there? I've definitely felt that around all my neighbours, for sure.
Oh, Fred, thank you so much for coming on the show. You've made me really, really want to come and visit you now.
Cool.
So I will hopefully put something in the diary once Corona, etc. allows.
No, thanks for having me. It's really nice. It's nice
really,
to
really good.
Just take a moment to be reflective for a change, instead of, being head down in the routine.
It's Farmer Focus.
Somerset farmer Fred Price. Head to YouTube for the full version of that interview and lots more besides. Just search for Meet the Farmers podcast. I'm taking a break from the podcast next week, so there won't be a show next Monday, I'm afraid, but I'll be returning in 2 weeks' time on Monday, the 27th of July, when I'll be speaking to BBC Countryfile presenter Sean Fletcher. Until then, I hope you have a great couple of weeks, and I'll see you next time on Meet the Farmers.